A black lawyer walks into court. Then everything changes. Malcolm Price, a seasoned attorney, arrived at the courthouse ready for the biggest case of his career. But the moment he stepped inside, a security officer stopped him. Deliveries go through the back. Asterisk. Malcolm adjusted his tie. I'm an attorney. Asterisk. The officer laughed. Nice try. Asterisk. Other lawyers walked past. Unchecked. Malcolm showed his bar ID, his credentials, his case docket. Still, they grabbed his arm, dragged him away. Minutes later, after his white paralegal intervened, the officers were fired on the spot. But the damage was done. Because in here, sometimes, your qualifications don't matter as much as the color of your skin. The morning sun streamed through the dirty glass of the diner's window, casting a golden haze over the counter where Samuel sat, stirring his coffee with slow, measured strokes. The spoon clinked against the ceramic mug, an absent rhythm to the hum of conversation around him. He had been coming to Earl's Diner for years, every Wednesday morning after his night shift at the post office. It was a ritual, one of the few things in life he could control. But today, he felt something different in the air. Not the scent of burnt toast or the hiss of grease from the griddle, but a quiet shifting, a rearranging of space around him. Across the counter, a white man in a crisp, buttoned shirt, one of the corporate types who worked downtown, lifted his coffee to his lips but kept his eyes trained on Samuel. Studying him, not outright staring, but that half second too long. That weight of suspicion. Samuel didn't acknowledge it. He never did. Instead, he turned his focus back to his breakfast. Back to the way the eggs slid against his fork. Back to the way the coffee burned just slightly against his tongue. He had learned, a long time ago, that being a black man in America was about learning to ignore, to navigate, to survive. The shift. The bell above the door jingled, and in walked a man Samuel had seen before. Officer Grayson. He wasn't in uniform today, but the way he carried himself, the weight in his shoulders, the slow and deliberate way he scanned the room, made it clear that he didn't know how to move through the world as anything but a cop. Morning, fellas, he said, to no one in particular. But his gaze landed on Samuel. Samuel nodded. A reflex, a habit, a small gesture that neither invited nor rejected. Grayson slid onto a stool at the counter, just one seat away, and turned slightly in Samuel's direction. How's the job treating you? He asked. Too casual. Samuel kept his expression even. Same as always. Grayson smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was a testing smile. The kind of smile men like him gave when they wanted to remind you of where you stood. You work at that post office downtown, don't you? Samuel nodded once. That's right. Grayson took a sip of his coffee. That's a government job, ain't it? Samuel set his fork down. He knew what was coming. Yes, sir. Grayson chuckled, shaking his head slightly. You know, my uncle worked there, back when it was different. Different. The word hung between them, thick and heavy. The man across the counter, the one in the crisp white shirt, smirked into his coffee cup. He wasn't part of the conversation, but he wasn't not part of it either. Samuel exhaled slowly. Everything changes. Grayson nodded, but there was something in his expression that said he didn't agree. I guess it does, he said, lifting his cup. Some things, though, he trailed off, leaving the sentence open, unfinished, like a loaded gun sitting on a table. Samuel could hear it clear as day. Some things don't. The unspoken rules. A waitress, Betty, moved toward them with the coffee pot. Her face tight. She had been working at Earl's as long as Samuel had been eating there. And she knew how to read a room. She refilled Samuel's cup without being asked, her hand lingering a second longer than necessary. A small thing, a quiet kind of protection. But it didn't change the air. Grayson drummed his fingers against the counter. You ever feel like, he started, voice low, leaning in just enough that Samuel had no choice but to engage. Some folks get opportunities they didn't exactly earn? Samuel knew the question wasn't really a question. It was a statement. He had heard it 1,000 different ways. He could hear the words that weren't being said. You shouldn't be here. You got here because someone let you in. This job, This diner, this seat, you think it belongs to you. But it doesn't. Samuel took a long sip of his coffee. He wasn't going to give Grayson what he wanted. No anger, no satisfaction, no confirmation. Instead, he set his cup down and met the officer's eyes. Steady, unblinking. I think, he said, voice even, that folks work for what they got. Grayson's smile faded just slightly. Betty cleared her throat. You want anything else, officer? He leaned back in his seat, stretching his arms. Nah, just checking in. The exit. The diner wasn't silent, but it had shifted. Conversations were quieter. Movements were slower. People were watching without looking. Samuel felt it in his bones. The way moments like this never really ended. They just hung in the air, waiting for the next one to start. Grayson tapped a dollar bill on the counter and stood. Good seeing you, Gaines, he said. Too familiar. Be safe out there. Samuel didn't respond. Grayson clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. It was meant to be friendly. It wasn't. The bell above the door jingled again. And he was gone. The man across the counter, the one in the crisp white shirt, folded his newspaper. He didn't smirk this time. Samuel finished his coffee. Another day, another wait. He picked up his briefcase and walked into the morning. The morning air was thick with August heat. The kind that settled heavy on the skin before the sun had even climbed all the way into the sky. Samuel walked the 6 blocks to the post office like he always did. His briefcase swinging at his side. His shoes tapping against the cracked pavement. The encounter at Earl's Diner still sat heavy in his chest. But he did what he always did. Pushed it aside, folded it up, and carried on. But the thing about these moments was that they never really left. They just stacked up, one on top of the other, like bricks in a wall. The post office and the thin line. Samuel stepped inside the post office and let the cool air hit his skin. It was still early, and the main floor was quiet except for the hum of the sorting machines in the back. He nodded at the young clerk. Eddie, a white kid barely out of high school, who stood behind the counter flipping through a stack of mail. Mornin', Mr. Gaines, Eddie said, eyes bright, like someone who hadn't yet been worn down by the weight of the world. Mornin', Eddie, Samuel said, setting his briefcase down. Before he could sit, he heard his supervisor, Mr. Lawson, call from across the floor. Gaines. A word. Samuel knew that tone. It was the kind of tone white men used when they wanted you to come to them but didn't want to say please. He exhaled slowly, ran a hand down the front of his shirt to smooth the fabric, and walked toward the glass office in the back. Mr. Lawson was already sitting, hands folded on his desk. He didn't ask Samuel to take a seat. He never did. Morning, Samuel said, standing just inside the door. Lawson nodded. Listen, got a little something I need to run by you. Had a complaint. The way he said it. Had a complaint. Like he was talking about a weather report. Samuel kept his face even. That right? Lawson tapped his fingers on the desk. Yeah, one of our regular customers. Mr. Peterson. You know him? Samuel did. An old white man who came in every Friday. Always in his pressed suit. Always with his gold watch shining under the fluorescent lights. He never spoke directly to Samuel unless it was absolutely necessary. And when he did, it was clipped, precise, as if Samuel's presence itself was a burden. What about him? Lawson sighed, like this was just another thing on his long list of annoyances. He said you weren't, let's say, as helpful as you should have been last week when he came in. Samuel could already see where this was going. He came in looking for a package that hadn't arrived yet. Samuel said evenly, told him the system said it was delayed. Gave him the tracking number. Told him when to check back. Lawson leaned back in his chair. Yeah, well, he seems to think your attitude was a little sharp. Sharp. That word. The one they always used when a black man didn't bend over backwards to make them comfortable. Samuel kept his expression neutral. Did he say I was rude? Lawson shrugged. He didn't say anything rude. Just said you had a tone. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. Just slightly. A tone. It didn't matter that he had given Mr. Peterson the exact same answer any of the white clerks would have given him. Didn't matter that he had done his job. Just like he always did. What mattered was that he hadn't smiled enough. That he hadn't made himself small enough. I was professional, Samuel said, keeping his voice even. I'm sure you were. Lawson sighed again. Rubbing his temple like this was giving him a headache. Look, I know these things get blown out of proportion. But I need you to. Quote. He paused, searching for the right words. Be mindful. You know how some folks are. Samuel did know. He knew exactly how some folks were. They were the kind of folks who didn't want a black man handing them their mail unless he smiled first. Unless he nodded like he was grateful just to be there. They were the kind of folks who would never come out and say what they meant. But they would make sure you felt it in 1,000 little ways. Samuel swallowed back the bitterness rising in his throat. What do you need me to do, sir? Lawson gave him that forced, managerial smile. Just be aware of how you come across. You know, keep things light. Some of our older customers. Quote. Our older white customers. You mean, they're used to a certain level of service. Samuel nodded once. I understand. Lawson smiled like the matter was settled. Good man. And just like that, the conversation was over. The walk back. Samuel stepped out of the office and back onto the floor. Eddie glanced up, a question in his eyes. But he didn't ask. He just nodded. And Samuel nodded back. He walked to his station, placed his briefcase down, and opened his ledger. But the numbers blurred in front of his eyes. He knew the rules of this game. They weren't written down, but they were just as real as the walls around him. It didn't matter how hard he worked. Didn't matter how professional he was. There would always be a line he wasn't allowed to cross. And worse than that, a line he wasn't even allowed to acknowledge existed. Because the moment he named it, the moment he said it out loud, they'd call him angry, difficult, unprofessional. He pressed his fingers into his temple, letting out a slow breath. Another brick on the wall. The unfinished letter. That night, when Samuel sat at his kitchen table, he pulled out a notepad and started writing. Dear Mr. Peterson. He stared at the words for a long time. What could he say? That he was sorry for not smiling enough? That he should have made himself smaller, softer, easier to digest? He gritted his teeth, crossed out the sentence, and started again. Dear Mr. Peterson. Another pause. He tapped his pen against the table. The same rhythm as the spoon in his coffee that morning. Finally, he set the pen down. There was no point in writing this letter. It would never be enough. Instead, he tore the page out, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the trash. He sat back, looking at the ceiling, letting the weight of the day settle in his bones. The door had never really been open for him. And maybe, it never would be. Samuel woke before dawn, as he always did, moving through his morning routine with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that time was never truly his own. The city was different in those early hours. Before the sun had fully stretched itself over the rooftops. The streets were empty, except for the occasional garbage truck rumbling past or the shopkeepers rolling up their metal gates. He liked it that way. Because once the city woke up, once the people filled the sidewalks, the buses, the storefronts, he would have to navigate it all over again. The expectations, the invisible rules, the weight of being a black man in a world that had already decided where he did and didn't belong. But today was different. Today, he was going somewhere new. The bank and the first step. Samuel stood outside Commerce National Bank, adjusting his tie, his fingers smoothing the fabric more times than necessary. He had prepared for this. He had spent weeks going over his business proposal, crunching the numbers, making sure everything was airtight. He had written and rewritten his pitch so many times. He could recite it in his sleep. It was time. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and fresh ink. The kind of place where money moved between hands with just a signature. Where the right last name could open doors that had been closed for generations. Samuel felt the shift the moment he walked in. The way the teller at the counter stiffened slightly. The way the older woman in the waiting area clutched her purse a little tighter. The way the bank manager, a tall man with silver at his temples and a voice that rarely needed to rise, eyed him from across the room before gesturing for him to wait. None of this was new. But it didn't make it easier. The meeting that wasn't. After 15 minutes, the manager, Mr. Caldwell, finally waved him over. Samuel stepped into the office, taking the seat across from the large mahogany desk. Mr. Caldwell leaned back, hands folded, his expression polite but distant. "So," he said, barely glancing at the folder Samuel had placed in front of him. "You're looking for a loan?" "Yes, sir," Samuel said, keeping his voice measured. "For a small business, a tailoring shop." Caldwell flipped open the folder with the disinterest of a man already settled on his answer. "Tailoring," he mused, tapping a pen against his desk. "That's quite the industry." Samuel forced himself to nod, even though the words weren't meant as encouragement. "I've been in the trade for 15 years, he said. "I've built up a strong customer base. I've done all the numbers." Quote. Caldwell held up a hand, stopping him. "I'm sure you've put a lot of thought into this, Mr. Gaines," he said smoothly. "But you see, banks like ours, we have certain policies." Samuel knew where this was going before the man even finished the sentence. Policies. Another word for excuses. Another way of saying not you. Not now. Not ever. We typically require a substantial amount of collateral for small business loans. Caldwell continued, flipping through the papers. "And from what I see here, I just don't think we'd be able to take on the risk." Samuel's fingers curled slightly against his knee. Risk. He had seen men walk out of this office with loans twice this size. Men who had no experience, no business plan, nothing but the right last name and a handshake. He exhaled slowly, keeping his voice steady. "I understand that risk is a concern," he said, "but I have a steady income, a proven customer base. I've attached letters of recommendation from several clients." Caldwell gave him a tight smile. "I'm sure you have, but unfortunately, at this time, we're unable to move forward with your request." Samuel let the words settle. They weren't just a rejection. They were dismissed. He had known it before he walked in. Hadn't he? That this seat, in this office, wasn't meant for him. Still, he had hoped. And that was the part that stung the most. He rose, reaching for his folder, but before he could turn, Caldwell spoke again. "You might try the local credit union," he said, as if that were a favor. "They sometimes handle businesses like yours." Samuel clenched his jaw, but he didn't let himself react. Instead, he nodded once, tight and controlled. "Thank you for your time." And with that, he left. The walk that felt longer than before. Outside, the city had fully woken up. Cars honked, people moved past him on the sidewalk, and shopkeepers shouted their morning greetings. It was the same city he had walked through that morning. But somehow, it felt different now. The bank's rejection sat heavy in his chest. Not just because it was unfair, but because it was expected. Because it was just another door that had never really been open in the first place. Because the men inside that bank had already decided who was worth betting on. And it had never been men like him. Still, he kept walking. Not because he wasn't tired. Not because he wasn't angry. But because he had no other choice. The diner had been there for as long as Samuel could remember. It sat on the corner of 8th and Vine. Its windows fogged from the heat of the griddle. The scent of bacon and fresh coffee curling through the doorway. The kind of place where businessmen in crisp suits and construction workers in dusty boots sat side by side, nursing cups of coffee that never seemed to empty. For years, Samuel had walked past it on his way to work. And for years, he had never once set foot inside. Because he knew better. Some doors stayed closed, even when they stood wide open. But today, he was tired. Tired in a way that went beyond sore muscles or a long day. Tired in a way that settled into his bones. That made his fingers feel heavy just reaching for the door handle. So, against better judgment, he went in. The silence that spoke first. The bell above the door chimed. And the moment Samuel stepped inside, the air shifted. It was subtle, but he felt it. The way the waitress behind the counter hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before continuing to pour coffee. The way one of the old men near the window, the kind who had probably been sitting in that same booth since the war ended, lowered his newspaper just enough to glance over. the way the man behind the register, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face carved out of stone, set his jaw just a little tighter. Samuel knew this feeling, the quiet calculation of whether or not he was worth the trouble. He walked toward the counter, pulling out a stool, and sat down. He didn't fumble, didn't hesitate, because if you showed doubt, even for a second, they would smell it on you. A waitress, young, blonde, wearing a uniform that had probably been washed one too many times, approached cautiously. "Coffee?" she asked. Her voice was polite, but polite in the way that kept a person at arm's length. Samuel nodded. "Black." She poured, and for a brief moment, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be a problem. But then, he heard it, the voice from the booth. "Well, I'll be damned." Samuel didn't turn. He didn't have to. He already knew what was coming. "I thought this place had standards." The voice continued, slow, deliberate, like a man who wanted to be heard. "Didn't know just anybody could walk in and sit down these days." A few chairs creaked. A fork scraped against a plate. The kind of noises that told Samuel that everyone had heard it. But no one was going to say anything. He took a slow sip of coffee. It was hot, bitter. "Something on your mind?" he asked. Voice even. The man behind him chuckled. The sound wasn't friendly. "Just wondering if you got turned around." "As all," the man said. "You people usually get your coffee somewhere else." The waitress who couldn't look him in the eye. Samuel exhaled slowly, setting his cup down. The waitress wouldn't look at him. Her hands twisted in the rag she was holding. She heard what was being said. She knew it was wrong. But she wasn't going to say a damn thing. And neither was the man behind the register, who was still watching from a few feet away, his fingers tapping slow, steady against the countertop. This wasn't a shouting kind of place. No slurs, no fists, no broken bottles. No, this kind of place was different. It was quieter, more insidious. The kind of place where they wouldn't throw you out. They would just make you want to leave. The second decision. Samuel could feel the stares pressing in on him. Could feel the weight of all the unspoken rules. The quiet expectations. The invisible line that had been drawn in the air before he even walked in. And he had a choice. He could leave. Walk out. Let the door swing shut behind him. Pretend like this place didn't exist. Or, he could stay. The stand that nobody saw. Samuel lifted his coffee cup. Took another slow, deliberate sip. And when he set it back down, he did so without hurry. Without hesitation. The man in the booth scoffed. Waiting for him to get angry. Waiting for him to flinch. But Samuel didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a few coins, and set them on the counter. Then, he turned to the waitress. "Another cup." The words were quiet, but in that moment, they were louder than any argument, sharper than any curse, because he wasn't moving, and they all knew it. The weight of being unwelcome. The diner didn't explode into chaos. There was no fight, no shouting, just silence. The waitress, after a long hesitation, poured him another cup. The man in the booth muttered something under his breath, but he didn't say anything loud enough for Samuel to hear. And the man behind the register? He went back to counting change. But the weight in the room remained. It always did. Because the hardest fights weren't the ones you saw. They were the ones that happened in moments like these. In the places where you were never supposed to be. At the counters you weren't meant to sit at. Drinking coffee that they never intended to serve you. Samuel lifted the cup to his lips, letting the heat sit on his tongue. And in that small, defiant moment, he tasted victory. Samuel had learned, long ago, that certain rules weren't written for men like him. Or rather, they were, but only in a way that would keep him exactly where he was supposed to be. And God help you if you forgot that. The problem with rules was that they gave people a way to smile while they put you in your place. To make it seem like they weren't the ones making the decision. Just following protocol. That's what Samuel kept telling himself as he stood there, staring at the woman behind the counter. Because if he didn't remind himself of that, he'd start believing the lies she was selling. The office with no name. He had been working in the city for 2 years now. And every morning, without fail, He walked past the glass doors of a building that was too polished. Too clean. Too much of something he wasn't supposed to be a part of. Inside, men in dark suits walked with the kind of purpose that came only when you were sure that every door would open for you. Samuel had told himself that one day, he would walk through those doors, too. And today was that day. He had earned it. A friend had tipped him off to a job opening. The kind that paid enough to lift you up. Just a little. And Samuel had spent the last 3 nights ironing his best shirt. Going over every possible interview question. Making sure his shoes shined enough to reflect the streetlights. Because in a world like this, he couldn't afford to be anything less than perfect. The pause that gave it away. The woman behind the front desk didn't sneer. She didn't roll her eyes or shake her head. She smiled. And that was worse. Because Samuel knew that kind of smile. The kind people used when they were about to tell you that your check didn't clear. That the apartment was already rented. That this job had suddenly, unexpectedly, just been filled. She glanced at the paper in his hands. Then back at his face. "I'm sorry," she said, too smoothly. "You must be mistaken. This isn't the place for that kind of application." Samuel exhaled slowly, tightening his grip on the envelope. "Ma'am," he said, calm, even, controlled, "I believe I have the right place." She hesitated. A flicker of something uncertain crossed her face. Not doubt, not guilt, just the smallest moment where she realized that maybe, just maybe, Samuel wasn't going to back down as easily as she expected. And that annoyed her. "The gatekeeper. I don't believe we're hiring right now," she said, shifting her tone. Not saying he couldn't apply. Just saying, it wouldn't matter if he did. A man walked in behind him. White, younger, wearing a suit that hadn't seen a secondhand store before. The receptionist didn't pause. "Good morning, sir," she said brightly. "Are you here for the finance position?" Samuel felt that hit, deep in his chest. Because that was the job. His job. The one he had come here for. The one they weren't hiring for. Until someone else walked in. The difference between a man and a problem. He had seen this before. Everywhere. It was the same thing in restaurants that claimed they were out of tables. In stores where the clerk watched his hands like he might steal something. He had learned, young, that a black man in the wrong place wasn't a man. He was a problem. And problems needed to be handled. He could see it now. How she was handling him. Calm, polite. She wouldn't throw him out. That would be too obvious. But she would make sure that by the time this conversation was over, he would walk out on his own. Because that's how it worked. They didn't have to tell you to leave. They just had to make you believe you didn't belong. The decision that changed everything. Samuel adjusted his tie. He had prepared for this interview. He had earned this interview. And he wasn't about to let some woman with a polite smile take that from him. So, he did the one thing she didn't expect. He stepped forward, calm, steady, and he placed his resume right there on the desk. "You should take this," he said, looking her right in the eye. Not asking, not apologizing, not letting her decide, for him, what he could or couldn't do. The room felt heavier. A moment stretched. Longer than it should have. Then, something happened. Something Samuel hadn't counted on. The man who was watching. A voice spoke up from behind him. "Excuse me," it said. "What's going on here?" A man had stepped out from one of the glass-walled offices. Older, tall, the kind of man people didn't ignore. And right now, he was looking at Samuel. And at the receptionist. And the resume is still sitting on the desk. Samuel could feel the woman stiffen. Could see, in the way she suddenly straightened her shoulders, that she was already thinking of a way to explain this. But before she could open her mouth, Samuel spoke first. "My name is Samuel Lewis," he said, voice strong. "I'm here for the finance position." The older man frowned. "We're still accepting applications," he said slowly, his eyes shifting toward the receptionist. "Aren't we?" There it was. The moment where the rules broke down. Where someone else, someone who wasn't supposed to, saw the lie. The woman hesitated. Then, slowly, reluctantly, she picked up Samuel's resume. "Yes," she said, her voice quieter than before. "Yes, we are." Samuel didn't smile. didn't gloat. Because this wasn't a victory. This was survival. The older man nodded toward the hallway. Well, Mr. Lewis, he said, let's see what you've got. The wait of a moment. As he followed the man down the hall, Samuel didn't let himself relax. Because he knew, even now, even here, that there were still a dozen more battles waiting for him behind every door. That no matter how many times he proved himself, he would have to do it again. And again. And again. Because the rules had never been written for him. And the moment he forgot that, he would lose everything. But today, at least, he had broken through the first door. And for now, that was enough. Samuel sat across from the hiring manager. Hands folded neatly on the table. His back straight. His breath steady. Everything about him, his suit, his posture, his carefully measured tone, was designed to put people at ease. To show them that he wasn't a threat. That he was smart enough to be here. Polite enough to be here. Safe enough to be here. And yet, he could feel it. That thing hanging in the air. The thing he was never supposed to acknowledge. But it was there. And it had been there from the moment he walked in. The unwritten test. The hiring manager was a man named George Holloway. Older, white, well-dressed in a way that spoke of comfort rather than effort. He had one of those easy, confident faces. The kind that belonged to men who had never been told they didn't belong somewhere. The kind who had always known that doors would open for them. He was smiling, friendly, even. But Samuel knew better. Because he had seen this before. This wasn't a job interview. This was a test. A test that wasn't written down anywhere. A test that had nothing to do with his resume. And everything to do with him. The first question wasn't a question. So, Holloway said, leaning back in his chair. I have to say, I wasn't expecting you. Samuel tilted his head slightly. I'm sorry? Your application, Holloway continued, tapping his fingers against the table. I looked at it. Of course. Impressive credentials. But, you know, quote. A pause. Just long enough. I was expecting someone else. Samuel didn't blink. There it was. Right out in the open. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't even disrespectful. It was just that thing. That moment where people told themselves. Where they let you know. Without letting you know. What they really thought. He had seen it so many times. And yet, it still stung. The careful dance. He smiled. Not too much. Because too much smiling could be read as desperate. And not enough could be read as arrogant. I hope I can exceed your expectations. He said smoothly. Holloway chuckled. I like that. Confidence is good, he said, as if Samuel's confidence was something he had the power to grant. Then he glanced down at the resume again. I see you went to Morehouse, he said. The way he said it, Samuel knew exactly what he meant. He didn't say, I see you went to a great school. He said, I see you went to Morehouse. And Samuel could hear the question underneath it. A question he had been answering his entire life. The second test. The rest of the interview was routine. On the surface. But Samuel knew better. Because this wasn't about his skills. It was about how he made Holloway feel. It was about whether he made the white men in this office comfortable. And the longer they talked, the more Samuel could feel it. The wall. The invisible wall. The one built out of things no one would ever say out loud. The unspoken decision. Samuel had given all the right answers. He had proven himself 10 times over. But he already knew. Knew it before Holloway even opened his mouth. Well, Mr. Lewis, Holloway said, standing up, extending a hand. We'll be in touch. And there it was. We'll be in touch. Not, you'll be hearing from us soon. Not, this was a great conversation. And I think you'd be a strong candidate. Just those 5 words. A polite way of saying. This was over before it even began. The decision Samuel had to make. As Samuel walked out of the office. Past the receptionist who had tried to turn him away. Past the men in dark suits who barely looked at him. He had a choice to make. He could walk away, like they wanted him to. Or, he could make sure they remembered his name. He glanced at the business card in his pocket. The one given to him by the only man in that office who had actually looked him in the eye. The senior partner. the one who had watched the entire exchange from his glass-walled office. Samuel had a feeling that this fight wasn't over yet. And if there was one thing he had learned in his life, it was that sometimes, the only way through a wall was to break it down. Samuel sat in the conference room, waiting. The senior partner had called him back. Not Holloway. Not the man who had tested him with every carefully veiled remark. Every pause that lasted just a second too long. Not the man who had already decided, before Samuel even walked in, that he wasn't the right fit. No, this call had come from someone higher up. Someone whose office had glass walls and a view of the city. Someone who had watched, who had seen the test, and who had decided, maybe this story isn't over yet. The second interview. The senior partner's name was Robert Kessler. And the first thing Samuel noticed about him was the silence. Not the kind of silence that demanded answers. Not the kind that waited for an explanation. But the kind that studied you. That calculated. That tried to figure out if you were worth the effort. I heard you had an interesting conversation with Holloway, Kessler finally said, folding his hands on the table. It wasn't a question. Samuel smiled. Just a little. He had a lot of expectations. He said, his voice even. And I didn't meet them. Kessler's lips twitched. Just slightly. Then, he leaned back in his chair. That's the problem with expectations, he said. They can be very rigid. Samuel held his gaze. There it was again. The game. The words that meant more than what was actually said. The choice on the table. Kessler steepled his fingers. I'm not going to waste your time, he said. Holloway already made up his mind about you. He's not going to change it. Samuel nodded, unsurprised. But, Kessler continued, I have the power to override that decision. Samuel waited. He had been here before. And he knew better than to make it easy for them. Because men like Kessler liked to believe they were doing you a favor. That their approval was a gift. That their invitation was a privilege. And Samuel had learned, you don't take a gift when you know the price is too high. So, he waited. And finally, Kessler gave him what he wanted. The condition. There's an opening in our real estate division, Kessler said. I'd like to offer it to you. Samuel exhaled slowly. There it was. The condition. Because he hadn't applied for real estate. He had applied for corporate law. For mergers and acquisitions. For the division that handled the kind of contracts that shaped industries. That built fortunes. That moved power from one set of hands to another. And they didn't want him there. They wanted him somewhere else. Somewhere where he wouldn't be in the room when the real decisions were made. The same story. Again. Samuel had seen this before. Had lived it. Had watched men like Kessler present an offer that was meant to look like a favor. When really, it was a fence. A way to keep him in his place. A way to let him in. Without really letting him in. He could already hear the excuses. The justifications. It's still a great opportunity. You'll still be making good money. You'll still be part of the firm. But he knew the truth. He wouldn't be in the rooms where it happened. He wouldn't be at the table. He would be adjacent to power. But never part of it. And that wasn't enough. The answer. Kessler watched him, waiting for a response. Samuel took a breath. Steady. Measured. Because he knew that whatever he said next would follow him. Would shape the way they talked about him after he left this room. Would determine if his name was ever spoken in this firm again. So, he chose his words carefully. I appreciate the offer, he said, his voice calm. But I didn't apply for real estate law. Kessler's expression didn't change. I applied for M&A. Samuel continued. And I'd like to be considered for the position I actually came here for. Kessler tilted his head slightly. Are you sure? And there it was. That question wasn't a question. The kind that asked, are you sure you know your place? Samuel let the silence settle before answering. I am. Kessler sighed. Sitting back. He studied Samuel again. Measured him. Weighed the cost of fighting for him. And then, he nodded. All right, he said. I'll see what I can do. The wait. Samuel left the office knowing two things. 1. He might never hear from them again. And 2. If he did, it would mean something. Because he had said no to the crumbs. Because he had refused the fence. Because he had made them see that he wasn't asking to be let in. He was demanding his seat at the table. And that was something men like Kessler weren't used to. So, he walked out into the cold morning air, his breath fogging in front of him, his heart steady, and he waited. Because some walls don't come down unless you make them fall. And he had just started shaking the foundation. Samuel was back in the waiting room. But this time, it felt different. The air wasn't heavy like before. The silence wasn't thick with doubt. Because now, they needed to answer him. Not the other way around. The call that came too late. A week had passed. 7 days of waiting. 7 days of knowing that his decision had forced a conversation behind closed doors. 7 days of wondering whether the weight of his rejection had shifted anything at all. Then, the call came. Kessler's assistant. Not Kessler himself. Not the man who had studied him like a calculation. Just the voice of someone who had been told to deliver a message. Mr. Carter, we'd like you to come back in. There's been an update. The final room. The office looked the same. But Samuel could tell. Something had changed. Holloway wasn't there this time. Only Kessler. And that was already an answer in itself. Because men like Holloway didn't stay in rooms when they lost. Kessler motioned to the chair across from him. Samuel didn't sit right away. Didn't make it easy. Because he had learned. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them feel the weight. Finally, Kessler exhaled. All positions for this hiring cycle have been filled. He said. Samuel kept his face unreadable. He had expected this. The rejection wrapped up in professional language. The refusal disguised as timing. But then, Kessler leaned forward. But, he continued, his voice quieter now, we'd like to keep in touch. The soft offer. Samuel almost laughed. There it was. The test after the test. Are you willing to wait for permission? Moment. Are you willing to let us hold the door half open while you stand outside? Moment. Because they still didn't want to offer him the position outright. They still wanted him to prove that he would be grateful just to be considered. Still wanted him to wait until they decided they were comfortable enough. And Samuel had spent enough of his life waiting. The real answer. So, he looked at Kessler, right in his eyes. And then he smiled. Not a grateful smile. Not a thank you for thinking of me smiling. But the kind of smile that said, I see exactly what you're doing. I appreciate the consideration, he said, his voice as steady as steel. But I won't be waiting. A flicker of something crossed Kessler's face. Not anger. Not disappointment. Something else. Something like respect. Because Samuel hadn't begged. Hadn't planned. Hadn't let them leave him hanging on a string. He had made the choice for them. And men like Kessler weren't used to that. The walk away. Samuel stood, buttoning his coat. Kessler didn't stop him. Didn't offer any more last-minute words. Didn't try to pull him back in with maybes or some days. Because he knew. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a man choosing his own future. And for the first time since he had walked into this office weeks ago, Samuel Carter felt lighter. Because he wasn't just leaving an interview. He was leaving their control. Leaving the idea that he needed their permission. Leaving the notion that he should be grateful for crumbs. And that was a freedom they couldn't take from him. The door that opened next. The day after he walked out, Samuel got a different call. A law firm in D.C. Bigger than Kessler's firm. More powerful. And this time, they weren't offering him a maybe. They were offering him exactly what he had wanted from the start. Because word had spread. About the man who had said no. About the man who hadn't begged. About the man who had turned down power. Because he knew he had his own. And suddenly, everyone wanted him. The truth they never say aloud. That was the thing they never told you. They only respect you when they can't control you. They only value you when they realize you don't need them. They only give you the seat after you prove you'll take it anyway. Samuel knew that now. And as he stepped onto the train to D.C. As he left the city behind. As he looked ahead to something bigger than he had imagined. He smiled. Because he had won. And this time, they all knew it.